I ultimately chose the path of tech sales over an MBA, and it was probably the best decision that I've ever made. I want to walk through both my experience from my own personal viewpoint, but also running the numbers on how it's worked out. If I had taken on the debt, if I had not worked for 2 years and then gotten a salary with an MBA, what would my career look like to date versus what it is right now in tech sales? Some really quick context. I had worked as an engineer for 3 years at a large Fortune 1000 company and also a small startup. And I really did not like engineering, which prompted me, like many of my colleagues, to start looking into an MBA. One of the things that I quickly realized amongst my colleagues and also people that I met on campus tours is the more I looked around, a lot of people looking for an MBA were not really sure what they wanted to do with their career. And that was something that really stuck with me, especially in my own case. Like, I certainly wanted to transition careers, but I had a very clear idea that I wanted to be an entrepreneur long term. And so the further I got into the MBA process, surrounded by other people that were kind of like, yeah, I'm in an engineering career or I'm an accountant. I'm not crazy about what I'm doing. I think an MBA is the best way for me to take the next step in my career. I realized that, at least from a peer standpoint, I really wasn't going to have any advantage. And I think a really key point for me is, one, I really thought about like what is going and getting an MBA on entrepreneurship going to get me that starting my own company cannot. And also two, I actually went to, I was being heavily recruited by Georgia Tech among other schools because I lived in Atlanta at the time. And one of the things that really got me to stop looking at an MBA altogether is I actually went to their case study day for their startup accelerator that they had at the business school. And there were 41 groups that presented. Out of 41, there were maybe 3 companies that actually had a genuine product already made and were actually getting revenue and selling the product. And at that point, I realized it was more of a production. Almost all of the people in this program were making companies because it was like an assignment that they took on and thought it would be fun, as opposed to something they truly intrinsically cared about and a problem that they actually knew existed that they wanted to solve. I could go on, but I digress. I think the big thing again is that I saw tons of people in an MBA program just wanted to do that more or less because they weren't sure what the next step in their career was, whereas I had a lot of clarity. Long term, I wanted to go into business for myself, and I didn't know that I could do that necessarily right away, but taking on $150,000 in loans, not working for 2 years in addition to that, when I could do something like sales, learn more directly about business without taking on all that debt, without taking on all the opportunity costs, it just started to make more and more sense the further I got into it. But I also saw tech sales as a lucrative option and something that could actually get me on the ground floor selling products, which I would need to do and was a very direct skill that candidly, I don't think MBA schools really teach you about. Sure, they can teach you theory, sure, you'll do a lot of presentations and case studies and try to get people to agree with your opinion, but when you're at a university, you're not actually selling a $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 product. It's not enough just to get people's opinion and say, yeah, your tool is cool. You actually have to get people to sign the dotted line. You actually have to get enterprise organizations to sign over a check. And I felt that there was just really limiting returns there from an MBA perspective. And given my very specific goal of going into business for myself, I knew that I could get as much or maybe even more value out of tech sales directly. But again, if you're an accountant and you want to go to Wall Street, or maybe you're an engineer and you want to transition more to a project manager role, as an example, at like a FANG company, an MBA is definitely a valid option. So if you have very real clarity on becoming a product manager, becoming, I don't know, a Wall Street banker, whatever it is, and you see an MBA as a very logical path, you've seen other people take that path successfully, I do think there's merit there. So again, this is my case and I have really enjoyed tech sales. I still knew that it wasn't worth the risk of taking on the extreme cost of an MBA. I know at Georgia Tech, tuition is, I think, $40,000 a year. I don't even think that factors in cost of living. And Cornell, which is another school that I visited, is $73,000 a year, which is like insane. So when you're considering the cost of these, which is where I really started to get to, is yes, there's obviously the tuition cost, but you factor in, like as an example, I was an engineer making just under $80,000 a year. And so not only is the cost of, let's say I go to Georgia Tech, $40,000, not even including living expenses, etc. So let's call it $50,000 a year. So I'd have to pay $100,000 to get this 2-year MBA. But additionally, I would not be working and missing out on a 2-year salary of $160,000. And even if you consider the alternative of going directly to tech sales, in my case, my starting salary as a SDR in tech sales was $75,000 a year. So even if we use that, I would be missing out on $150,000, and I would also be paying $100,000 to get an MBA. And so at that point, we're looking at basically an opportunity cost of $250,000. And again, maybe if you're in a situation where you have a full ride or you have the ability to pay for it, that's a different situation for you. But I really, again, when I was thinking to my own experience, having a lot of clarity around wanting to go into entrepreneurial things, wanting to go into sales, potentially even after getting an MBA, I just really started to question, am I willing to give away $250,000? And potentially, let's say I ended up going the product management route. I wasn't even convinced that I would even enjoy that. So here I am potentially spending $250,000 to then go work at a prestigious FANG company as a product manager, probably making $200,000 to $250,000, which is great, don't get me wrong. But if I hated that job, I'm in a worse situation. I now have $100,000 worth of loans that I've got to pay back, and the problem only compounded. I know that's kind of a worst case example, but the reason I bring it up is if you don't have clarity in why you want an MBA, if you hate your career and an MBA seems like it will get you to the next step, but that's it, you don't really know what it's going to get you, you don't have a specific reason in mind why you want an MBA, then I would really caution going the MBA route just to hope that it gets you a starting salary in 6 figures or whatever it might be. Like, let's take as an example, in Georgia Tech, I think their average starting salary is like $120,000 out of school. And again, let's keep in mind, that's after 2 years, $250,000 worth of opportunity cost like we talked about. Whereas if you switched over to tech sales without an MBA, your starting salary could be anywhere from maybe $70,000 to $100,000 on target earnings, so base and commission. But let's take my example. I made $75,000 and year one was my salary. In year two, I had had a lot of success and I was already at $110,000. Not to mention that year again, I was very fortunate to be in this position, but I well exceeded my quota and made between somewhere in between $160,000 to $180,000. So even in just those 2 years, not only had I not spent $250,000 to go to school, to not work for 2 years, but I had already made up the money and then some with my salary as well. And then after year two, I made a job change. My salary now is well into the 200s. And so my point being is not only when you consider the 2 years that I would have had to go to school, there's that $250,000 commitment. But in 2 years in tech sales, my salary now is higher than if I had gone to a MBA school and gotten a salary in the 120 to, I think Cornell is like 135,000 average starting salary. But the broader point being, I didn't have clarity on going and getting an MBA. I'm sure I could have done okay. I could have gotten A's and B's. I probably could have gotten a decent job, but I didn't know that I really would have liked that job any better than an engineering job. And on top of that, when you look back too, let's say I did tech sales for a year. Let's say you give it a shot and you don't like it. That's okay. Go and get your MBA at that point. Now you have even more clarity without committing upfront to that cost and maybe realizing that you could have gone the tech sales route instead. So again, just recapping kind of the major points and thought process that I had. One, when I started to look really deep into the MBA process, I noticed a lot of the peers, even some of the active students that I talked to, really didn't know what they wanted to do. And when I went to work and talked to some of my engineering friends that were thinking about an MBA, weren't crazy about engineering, they were kind of like, I don't really know what I want to do. That doesn't mean that just getting an MBA is going to make your life better. And I saw a very real scenario play out where had I done an MBA for 2 years, I could have gotten into a job that I still didn't like. And not to mention so many of my peers that were, like I mentioned, at my job and also meeting them on these different campus tours, these different campus events, weren't really sure what they wanted to do either. So like, what am I going to get? Especially knowing my personality, knowing that I really long-term, didn't enjoy working for other people and wanted to build something myself. I didn't see any value that an MBA could provide versus starting my own company versus trying something like sales directly to keep improving my skill set across the board in tech and position myself long-term to be able to make my own company, whatever that might be. Also, there's definitely an element too that I was looking strongly at their entrepreneurship route. It's like, so you went to school for entrepreneurship and you're applying for a job. Separate discussion altogether, but I saw that scenario too. If I didn't start a successful company and had to get a job, what value does having an MBA in entrepreneurship really get you? And the one caveat before restating some of the financial implications as well is if you do have clarity. I've met some people in finance who have always wanted to work at Wall Street. Maybe they started as an accountant, maybe they started in some sort of analyst role and are really trying to bolster their resume to get into top firms. Then absolutely, I think an MBA is a great route. The costs involved, I'm sure you have to run the numbers yourself, but the salaries on Wall Street are very lucrative. Certainly in tech sales, when you're getting to 5 to 10 years of experience, the salaries can be anywhere from maybe $300,000 to $500,000 plus, especially on great years. I think again, in my case, when you look at the finances, looking at a school like Georgia Tech, looking at a school like Cornell, the tuition costs at Georgia Tech were roughly $50,000 a year. The tuition costs all in at Cornell were like $75,000 a year. So we're talking about $100,000 or $150,000. The starting salaries at Georgia Tech when you graduated were about $120,000, $125,000. And I think at Cornell it was around $135,000. So when you factor that in, 2 years of all the costs involved, when instead you could just make that transition to tech sales, you could start working and build your resume up At the 2 to 5 year mark in tech sales, you're generally making at least 150,000 on target earnings. And certainly as you get to years 5 and beyond, you're at 300, 400,000 plus. Again, if you don't have any interest in sales, sure, this might not be the path for you. But if you're not sure what an MBA is going to get you, I don't recommend committing $100,000+ to just get another job at another tech company or wherever it might be that you still might not like. There's really no or very limited risk to ripping the Band-Aid and trying tech sales for maybe a year or two. If you don't like it, you can still get an MBA. And candidly, I can't speak for admissions officers, but if you were an engineer and you switched to tech sales and you did it for 2 years and you want your MBA, to me at least, I think that's almost more valuable because you've seen different elements of the tech world and you can say, yes, I used to be an engineer. I also went to sales, but I want to move more to an executive leadership, product management, whatever it might be. And I see that MBA as the path to get there. So again, there's no right or wrong answer here. The important thing with all of these videos is to give you a framework to assess what the best path might be. It's worked out really well for me. Again, like I mentioned, year 1, my salary was $75,000. Year 2, it was $110,000. I got a promotion to $130,000. And then I switched jobs after my second year in tech sales and I'm well into the 200s, almost $300,000 a year. So in my case, it's worked out very well. I would certainly recommend it if you've been thinking about sales and just haven't pulled the trigger. Look at that first way more heavily than looking at an MBA. But also, if you want to go to Wall Street, if you have a clear idea of what an MBA is going to get you, more power to you. Absolutely could be the right move. But anyway, I hope that helps. I am definitely biased towards tech sales, but if you have any inclination or any interest in sales, I think they're in almost 99 to 100% of cases, look at that first versus an MBA. But have a great week and we'll see you next time.